shows politically engaged. All four speakers are from Goldsmiths. Mariska Versantvoort is on the Cultural Studies MA. Neda is on the Contemporary Art Theory MA. Rebecca Eng is also on the Cultural Studies MA, and Sophie Hoyle is on the Masters of Flâneur. Mariska, would you like to go first?
Sure. In fact, I think we would be better off if we started with Sophie. Is that all right? So, of course. Yeah.
Hello, good morning. Today I'm going to be showing a video essay instead of giving a talk. So I'll just give a very brief introduction. In making artwork, I've been trying to reconcile different ways of visually representing social issues and conveying them with a sense of urgency or importance. But I've also been aware of the questionable power dynamics of production and distribution of certain images, specifically in contemporary art spaces. So this is a bit of an experiment to combine my research and video work, and it looks at, but has also ended up embodying, a lot of contradictions and tensions in attempting to be critical of the aestheticization of social issues, yet also struggling to find an aesthetic form that can communicate information in an effective way. So enjoy.
Lemon soap. Ginger ale. And tell him give me back of them doodles right there.
How much am I?
You don't hit nothing. A bag of them doodles.
Can I get you?
Down, right there. Down. One more, right there. And what else?
And 2 bags for my house.
Après dans mon bureau. Après dans mon bureau, je vous dis.
Coal production. China, 2,380 million tonnes. 6,000 known miners dead, 70,000 new cases of lung disease a year. USA, 1,053 million tonnes. 28 known miners dead, 30,000 new cases of lung disease a year. India, 492.95 million tonnes. Unknown miners dead, unknown cases of lung disease. 500,000 people die each year of coal-related lung disease, with many of those remaining invisible to the database machines they fuel. Each computer takes over 250 kilograms of fossil fuel to produce. Our way of life consumes bodies, lungs turn black, bones malform to feed the machines, muscles ripped and brains bludgeoned as we progress and develop towards a destination that never comes.
This paper concerns a work in progress. Please forgive me that I will be reading to you today. It's a subsection of what will be my MA thesis, in which I'm researching the various ways in which we began to problematize what we now know as the culture industry. The eventual aim of this research is, first of all, to account for the implicit dictimony within contemporary theory between culture as an original site for domination or as a site for resistance, through identifying the main premises of this discourse, and therewith to broaden and specify its scope through the relation between techne and modern subjectivity, and subsequently to go beyond these oppositions by drawing out three different and slightly more sophisticated perspectives on the economization of culture and the various forms of agency it fosters. Insofar as the above-mentioned debate tends to juxtapose Adorno and Horkheimer's account of the culture industry with Foucault's later writings, this presentation will first of all focus on identifying a concrete modern subject in Foucault's later writings, and secondly try to arrive at the initial outlines of a distinct notion of agency by reading this subject in relation to Benjamin's Flâneur. I will now give you a brief overview of the current debates within Foucault scholarship with regard to Foucault's later turn towards the subject and the stakes of this debate for my recent research as just outlined. Within Foucault scholarship, there's some dispute about whether or not Foucault became less political in his later work. According to Paras, Foucault continued to address questions of power and knowledge in his later lectures and History of Sexuality, Volume 2 and 3. However, they will no longer be the central axis of his research. In direct response to Paris, Hoffman, on the other hand, argues that Foucault did not become any less political. Moreover, he claims that Foucault's philosophical work cannot be understood if not seen in a dialectical relationship to his political activism. With regard to contemporary theories in the culture industry,
the stakes of this debate center around the question: how and to what extent could Foucault's later work be read as an account of social and political agency within culture? Foucault actualized his reading of ancient techniques of the self through a reappropriation of the Kantian essay Was ist Aufklärung. Furthermore, or perhaps however, it could be argued that this lecture, What is Enlightenment, delivered at UC Berkeley in 1983, was a response to Benjamin's essay on Baudelaire. For that reason, I will here make a first attempt to read Foucault's notion of the modern subject, not so much as an interpretation or a critique of, but as a performative endeavor that is inherently intertwined with the Kantian Enlightenment and developed in conjunction with Benjamin's notion of the Flâneur. Then, who is this modern subject in late Foucault? In Introduction to the Use of Pleasure, when explaining for the interruption between the publication of the first and the second volume of this series, Foucault wrote, and I quote, "But then, what is philosophy today? Philosophical activity, I mean, if not the critical work that thought brings to bear on itself. In what does it consist, if not in the endeavor to know how and to what extent it might be possible to think differently, instead of legitimizing what is already known?" In this fragment, Foucault characterizes his philosophical work as a form of parrhesia, or courageous truth-telling, as defined in his last lecture course, The Courage of Truth, which, however, must be distinguished from the Kantian notion of critique. According to Kant, man would be able to enlighten itself if only the freedom to use if only the freedom to make public one's use of reason was granted. It is not the use of pure reason itself, but the notion of freedom by virtue of which this can be done that constitutes Kant's understanding of technique. As Foucault, as well as Adorno and Horkheimer in the Dialectics of Enlightenment, points out, is that there is an inherent notion of sovereignty in Kant's concept of freedom. In his reading of the essay Was ist Aufklärung, Foucault argues that the notion of enlightenment, insofar as it appeals to a universal free subject, is superimposed on one another. Foucault here refers to the sophism found at the end of Kant's argument, where he offers a Prussian monarch, Frederick II, a contract of rational despotism, a reaction of which would face with the accusation of stupidity, laziness and cowardness. It's a lot of text, but I'm going to talk through most of it, so don't worry. Foucault's notion of truth-telling, on the other hand, could be summarized as follows. Ethical parrhesia is the simultaneous practice of, on the one hand, creating an explicit and fundamental link between the act of free-spokenness and the necessary unmediated conditions under which this can be done, with thus a strong emphasis on practice as that what one brings to bear upon one's own body over a particular discourse. That, on the other hand, demands the dramatization and consequent reversion of the four meanings of the true life in traditional philosophy, including the notion of the sovereign life, through which the life of the Cynic does not only become the scandalous manifestation of another life, but also necessarily bears witness to a possible other world. Whereas Adorno and Horkheimer have an exclusively negative understanding of enlightenment, for example, their notion of redemption signifies the original corruption of the modern subject, Foucault here holds on to a modernist notion of freedom, or specifically to a notion of free choice. Based on the definition above, this notion of free choice denotes two fundamental characteristics of the Cynic. First of all, the locus of this freedom is not within reason itself, but in the physical conditions of its practice. And secondly, it denotes the fact that the Cynic is necessarily unalloyed or unmediated by any discourse. Insofar as this definition of parrhesia, with regard to what Foucault sees as its modern descendants, is theorized on the basis of ancient practices of cynicism, it is the figure of the Cynic that constitutes Foucault's notion of the modern subject. The question left then is, how did Foucault bring to bear this practice of parrhesia, especially the dramatization and reversion of the sovereign life, with regard to Kant's essay? According to Paris, Foucault's lecture, What is Enlightenment, was what could be called an argumentative coup. on behalf of the latter. He therewith, quite surprisingly, defined Foucault's lecture as a sudden violent act of reasoning, which can be seen in this fragment taken from the text. Since this lecture was an implicit reaction to Benjamin's essay on Baudelaire, I will here try to define the initial outlines of both Foucault and Benjamin's notion of agency by a parallel reading of their concepts of the modern subject. Like Foucault, Benjamin too saw to some extent an important relation between modernity and antiquity. In discussing the work of the poet Baudelaire, and in particular in the essay The Paris of the Second Empire in Baudelaire, Benjamin states, "What antiquity and modernity share are mourning for what was and a lack of hope for what is to come." Insofar as Baudelaire wanted to be read as a classical poet, this, according to Benjamin, would mean that his poetry was, though involuntarily, aimed at creating a so-called Schockerfahren. In other words, his poetic labor, or fantastical fencing, would be constituted by the simultaneous act of, on the one hand, flânerie, that designates the act of spanning a threshold between the individual and the crowd, by physically bearing witness to the isolating narcotic effects brought about by the commodity, and most importantly, on the other hand, the act of heroism, understood as guarding this threshold through displacing this alertness to an erfaring, by means of creating memory traces of this isolated experience in the form of poetry. The displacement of shock from alertness to erfaring then exposes the necessarily isolated experiences of life on a design of commodity capitalism in all its nakedness, therewith unveiling the bourgeoisie ideology that covers modernity, hence the above-mentioned warning over an irretrievable loss, however not necessarily in a negative respect. Both Benjamin and Foucault read the modern subject as a militant figure. However, whereas the Cynic is necessarily self-conscious, for it sets out its own rules of conduct, Benjamin's subject is the involuntary protagonist of decay of experience in modern society. As a result of this, there's a slight discrepancy between Benjamin's notion of techne and his notion of agency. Insofar as poetic labor is essentially based on the failure of the shock defense for consciousness, Benjamin does not seem to account for how this failure is or could be brought about. This bears some resemblance to the dissociation or even distinction between techne and agency found in Adorno and Horkheimer. However, whereas the latter therefore cannot account for resistance within contemporary culture at all, Benjamin formulates a notion of non-human non-human agency that manifests itself in between the body of the modern subject and an external object, who are reconciled within the displacement of the event, in other words, in practice. Insofar as it could be argued that Foucault accepts Benjamin's supposition that there can be no form of experience outside of commodity capitalism, or more generally, outside those conditions that define modernity, enlightenment on that account is that what constitutes the conditions of modern-day parrhesia. It is therefore only through speaking the language of enlightenment itself, but neither arguing on behalf or against this discourse, as Foucault did in his lecture on Kant, that one is able to change the moral attitude, institutions, conventions, and way of living of one's time. As Hahn, another Foucault scholar, points out, Foucault's notion of agency, however, risks falling in contradiction with itself. The contradiction, according to her, would exist in Foucault's emphasis on a pre-ontological, self-constituting subject that simultaneously reflects upon its own conduct with reference to existing norms and fields of knowledge. A definition that can be found in the use of pleasure. However, there does not seem to be a notion of ontology in Foucault. To compare, it is Benjamin who made Baudelaire militant, for Baudelaire himself was not able to see the historical significance of his own undertaking. Although Benjamin's act of reading is self-conscious, performative, and highly politicized, he therefore still has to interpret Baudelaire's poems. Foucault, on the other hand, seems to reconnect in his reading of ancient cynicism, techne with episteme, especially knowledge of the self. It is here that Foucault's practice, and therewith his notion of agency, differs, though not fundamentally, from that of Benjamin. Within a broader project of the use of pleasure, was through the ancient practice of poesia that Foucault tried to account for the modern subject and its ability to set itself rules of moral conduct. So before being able to conclude in Foucault's notion of modern subjectivity and the feasibility of reading his later work within the context of the current debates on culture industry, I will first need to make a few statements on how Adorno and Horkheimer first developed this concept. The term culture industry was first used in the dialectics of enlightenment, and particularly in the chapter The Culture Industry, Enlightenment is Mass Deception. Culture industry, on their account, is the annihilation of singularity or freedom by means of mass media, which superimposes an ideologically informed false identity on society. First of all, the problematization of culture industry is based on a critique of the Kantian philosophy, and in particular on how the modern enlightened subject came into being. Secondly, as mentioned above, their account of culture is determined by a profound dissociation between the notion of techné and agency. Insofar as Foucault has a distinct notion of modern subjectivity and techné, namely the Cynic and the ancient practice of courageous truth-telling, or poesia, with an explicit orientation towards culture at large, namely his concern with accounting for a renewed understanding of moral conduct within Western society, Foucault's later work could be read in relation to the original discussion on culture industry as put forth by Adorno and Horkheimer. His notion of agency, as defined in relation to Benjamin, lies in the explicit self-conscious, free and meta-reflective practice of ancient cynicism that, through speaking the language of enlightenment itself, though in a necessarily unmediated way, is able to transgress social conventions, political institutions, values, and ways of living in Western society. Thank you.
Today I'm going to talk about the Lumpen aesthetic, or actually later on I will question whether this is a Lumpen aesthetic or not. This is a collection of thoughts that I've been trying to process whilst working out my dissertation thesis, so it's kind of crude, but I hope that something will come out of it. So first, what is low value? In the majority of high streets across the UK, multiple iterations of Poundland, Western Union and cash converters exist alongside empty retail premises. When will we finally witness the death of the marketplace, as in the death of the high street rhetoric that mainstream journalists and the British government have been lamenting for the last 6 years? In the meanwhile, is this what we could call a general condition of cheapness? It may seem obvious that in a time of crisis, less people are employed in wage labour. Less people can afford to consume little, less people receive less support. But how do we perceive this less? And is it really a meanwhile? Has anything actually changed at all? Basic knowledge of Marx tells us how values are ascribed to products of labour and how these supplant social relations, transforming, as he says in Capital, every product of labour into a social hieroglyphic. And as we know, manual labour time is concealed within the commodity. So thus, low-value commodities are necessary for the universal exploitation. So it could be proposed that crisis is not actually a death. Capitalism is a zero-sum game. Accumulation is speculation, is exploitation. So cheapness is prevalent, whilst the factory owner circulates the globe, attempting to locate the ideal site of production where labourers have the least right. We can typically understand cheapness as a result of the increased mechanization of production, the increased alienation of the worker from their product, lower quality materials, and lower quality control. But still, what is this lower, and what is this quality? Can we interpret what we see as the conditions of increased exploitation inherent in the product, as in the lowest return that the producer gains for their labour? Not always. Do we rather already understand that this cheapness is produced for a consumer with little financial means? Low value, high value. For Hegel, everything has a value. All the products of our labour are the result of a dialectical activity in manifesting the free sensuous expression of the absolute spirit. The whole of history can be rationally categorized into its teleological unfolding. At the end of history, anything goes, as long as it still ascribes to the knowledge of the idea. So we are told freedom is beauty. Servitude is necessary for realizing the self as well as the absolute. Thus, as capital takes the place of the divine, a low value is required not only to make us realize what is to be overcome, but is a necessity for accessing the ultimate goal. And thus, when the going gets tough, the tough gets going. Even though Marx negates Kant for being merely the passive consumer of the world surrounding him, it appears that there is a correlation between Kant's disinterested aesthetic judgment in the contemplation of the beautiful, and the idea that under capitalism nothing can be produced without an interest. That's Marx's idea. So a quote from the Strange Labour chapter in the Economic Manuscripts of 1844. In creating a world of objects by his personal activity, in his work upon inorganic nature, man proves himself as a conscious species being, i.e. as a being that treats his species as his own essential being, or that treats itself as a species being. Admittedly, animals also produce. They build themselves nests, dwellings, like the bees, beavers, ants, etc. But an animal only produces what it immediately needs for itself or its young. It produces one-sidedly, whilst man produces universally. It produces only under the dominion of immediate physical needs, whilst man produces even when he is free of physical need, and thus only produces in freedom therefrom. An animal produces only itself, while man reproduces the whole of nature. An animal's product belongs immediately to its physical body, whilst man freely confronts his product. An animal forms only in accordance with the standard and the need of the species to which it belongs, whilst man knows how to produce in accordance with the standard of every species, and knows how to apply everywhere the inherent standard to the object. Man therefore also forms objects in accordance with the laws of beauty. Although Kant posited that everyone could see the world in their own individual way, it seems that Marx also supposed that there is a common good. But given that it is impossible to realize objects for their own sake, we can posit that everything produced under capitalism is ugly. Next. What I'm currently trying to investigate is whether there might be a correlation between this and this and this. As we know, Stuart Hall famously tried to articulate the cultural hegemony of Thatcherism as cutting across all orthodox ideas of class, whilst relating this to the rise of the National Front. The notion of value for money is all-pervasive, whilst fixing some sort of solidarity against those who are not like us. In his Efflux article, Pasolini and Tottenham, Franco Bifo Berardi concedes that Pasolini was able to see fascism as something not of the past, but of the future, in cities ravaged by ugliness and consumerism. I admittedly haven't yet looked much into what Pasolini's own position was, and I think that although Bifo makes a lot of good points in this article, he ultimately ends up with too many contradictions to get into right now. However, I do want to question the apparently easy equation of ugliness with fascism, given the well-known history of fascism and purported ideals of beauty. And I guess most importantly, I felt compelled to more thoroughly answer his question of whether the riots of 2011 were examples of fascist consumerism or a Lumpen desacralization of consumerist rituals. Given that, as we know, the riots of 2011 were prompted by the killing of Mark Duggan by the police, it seems absurd that Bifo would bring up the first proposition. And although not everyone agreed with Cameron's assessment of criminality pure and simple, the element of consumerism was focused on by well-known figures from both the right and the left, including Hall, as was mentioned yesterday. Although I agree that taking things from shops does not negate the existence of commodities, it does negate exchange value. Continually going on about trainers and TVs is, in my view, completely short-sighted. Could, in fact, the targeting of businesses such as Poundland, Lidl and Ladbrokes be considered a negation of the top-down rationale for low value? The riot is a critical moment, a bottom-up negation of the system, not only by placing the individual in the lowest strata of society, but the prospects of shit work. Marx and Engels mention the Lumpen proletariat a few times in their writings, prominently in the 18th premiere of Louis Napoleon. Describing the waste of society outside of wage labour, such as criminals, the unemployed, and so-called degenerates, Marx posits that the Lumpen mass would never be able to achieve class consciousness, and hence are useless to the revolutionary struggle. Bonaparte was able to secure it as an independent power base, while simultaneously advancing the financial interests of the aristocracy. Marx suggested that Bonaparte was also a member of the Lumpen proletariat, for he was uninterested in productive activity. I think this could be alluded to Benjamin's representation of the indecisive king in his book, The Origin of German Tragic Drama. The figure of the beast unites the sovereign and the barbarian. It is perhaps this mirroring in the state of exception which enables the Lumpen to have the most potential to negate the sovereign position. If all labour is alienated, then perhaps it is only the Lumpen who can challenge the regime. I originally titled this The Lumpen Aesthetic, but I would actually like to pick this apart myself. First, in Lumpen, following the pre-established notion of the Lumpen proletariat as a non-productive subaltern group. In the Oxford Dictionary, the Lumpen is, following the Marxist definition, that who is uninterested in revolutionary advancement, or boorish and stupid. And also there's a specifically British definition of lumpy and misshapen, ugly and ponderous. Lumpen in German originally meant rags and then was used to describe a person in rags. even though, despite the representation in the media, the participants in the 2011 riots were not solely young or black, it is worth reflecting on the affirmative use of the term by figures from the black studies tradition, such as Fanon. Yet Tony Bogues, writing in 1977 in the context of the Battle of Lewisham, the well-known confrontation of anti-fascists with police following a large National Front rally, after 21 youths were violently arrested on accounts of mugging. He makes a distinction between the Black Youth in Revolt, which is the name of an article in an issue of International Socialism, and the Lumpen. Quote, "It is clear that black youth are not the dangerous scum who can be swung one way or the other. It is clear, for example, that black people could not join a fascist organization. Their anger and frustration cannot be channeled rightwards. Black youths are therefore not part of the Lumpen proletariat. They are part of the strata in the working class that is exploited and oppressed, and have reacted to their oppression not in an organized, overt manner, but in a spontaneous outburst against individual aspects of their oppression." End quote. Secondly, in the title Lumpen Aesthetic, I want to propose that perhaps this is not so much an aesthetic but an anti-aesthetic. It is a negation of all values. Okay, thank you. What I've tried to show is that notions of ugliness and beauty are multivarious and have obviously been attached to different values for different ideological purposes. I propose that this is part of an aesthetic segregation that is only fortified when passing judgments on what is cheap, trash, or of low value. Although many have described the riots as meaningless, I wonder if a preconceived idea is inherently necessary for political action. We know that the riots can be ended as soon as the police are deployed in the thousands, after enough footage of buildings and buses in flames has been disseminated by the media, and the riot has been reappropriated as justification for the deepening implementation of the authoritarian state, as well as an acceleration of already occurring processes of urban regeneration, for example in Peckham and Haringey. But ultimately, I propose that they might have been rendered impotent because even many of those on the left cannot get past preconceived notions of the good and bad, beautiful and ugly, and thus limit their own action. I would like to conclude with a quote from Benjamin's The Destructive Character. "The destructive character has the consciousness of historical man, whose deepest emotion is an insuperable mistrust of the course of things and a readiness at all times to recognize that everything can go wrong. Therefore, the destructive character is reliability itself. The destructive character sees nothing permanent, but for this very reason he sees ways everywhere. Where others encounter walls or mountains, there too he sees a way. But because he sees a way everywhere, he has to clear things from it everywhere, not always by brute force, sometimes by the most refined. Because he sees ways everywhere, he always stands at a crossroads. No moment can know what the next will bring. What exists he reduces to rubble, not for the sake of rubble, but for the way that of the way leading through it. The destructive character lives from the feeling not that life is worth living, but that suicide is not worth the trouble."
Abstraction and everyday protest in Sofia, and I have come to realize that the term and the notion of abstraction that I'm going to use is slightly, or maybe even more than slightly different from what we have been hearing these days, but I hope that this will be productive. So I will be talking about the aesthetics of everyday protest in Sofia, approaching them from the vantage point of a specific spatial product, and bringing them in conversation with the writings of Felix Guattari on the machinic assemblage. I will be exploring the way in which different interests and struggles, both of protesters and agents aligned with the government in power, have come to be articulated on and with the surface of a blackboard fence built on the 30th of November 2013 in response to clashes between anti-riot police and demonstrations. This was in front of the Parliament building in Sofia. From a position of strategic and inescapable closeness to the war in Sofia, I will try to approach questions about politics of urgency and abstraction. A site of struggle and unrest, a detested instrument of segregation and separation, an experimental ground. For me, the war is both a point of departure and an orientation device. In my talk, I will be looking closely at the spatial product and show why it might be useful to think about it as an assemblage in Guattari's sense. As I won't be offering a detailed account of the whole protest movement in Bulgaria going on since last year, let me say at least a few words about the wider context within which these struggles are operating. In February 2013, the previous government resigned after a few weeks of protests, initially spurred by outrage against high electricity bills, but quickly turning into anti-governmental protests. These were further accompanied by a call to do away with high-level corruption and the entrenchment of state and industry, respectively in this case with electricity companies. After the resignation of the government, pre-term elections were held in May 2013, and a minority government was formed by the Bulgarian Socialist Party in coalition with the Movements for Rights and Freedoms, which is a party representing largely Turkish and Roma minorities. As the coalition didn't have a total majority, it kept relying on the votes of the far-right nationalist party, Ataka, in order to hold parliamentary sittings and reach a quorum. The largest central-right party, GERB, thus remained in opposition. So it will take too much time to explain the particularities of the so-called Bulgarian left in the face of the Socialist Party in Bulgaria, but it might be worth saying that it is still largely associated with the communist regime of before 1989, while also considered as heavily dependent on Russian corporate interests. A big amount of MPs across the color spectrum and independent of party affiliations are former agents of the secret police, and some of them have been involved in large-scale deals throughout the 90s during the process of privatization of state companies. So these are some of the reasons why there is a strong sense of mistrust towards the ruling class and a general conviction that all politicians are corrupt. But on the 14th of June 2013, just a few days after the formation of the new government, Delian Peevski, son of the largest media magnate in Bulgaria, holding approximately 60% of the media assets, was appointed as head of the State National Security Agency. Conceived as an anti-corruption agency, the idea that it's going to be under the influence of a person who has already faced corruption allegations himself brought tens of thousands of people to the streets. They demanded Peevski to resign from the post. However, even after this happened, demonstrations kept on going, demanding the resignation of the government, stronger anti-corruption measures, free press, reforms in the electoral system, etc. So the protests have been going on since last year, and the government has not resigned, although it is now holding talks with the opposition and negotiating the conditions under which it might quit. So throughout the last year, there were demonstrations with as much as 70 to 100,000 participants. People went on hunger strikes, flash mobs were held, petitions made, universities occupied, to no avail. And we are now facing with the possibility of a deal made in Parliament on the same subject, resignation, over which these different forms of struggles were articulated by a large amount of the public. So this is why I think that it is crucial to look closer at the types of interventions that were made and keep being made as a form of everyday engagement with politics, with the historical past, and the type of reformulation that's public space underwent in this period. These small-scale interventions can be considered as critical entry points in the socio-political milieu and as an attempt to position oneself within that field. In order to understand the stakes involved in the protest with its various claims, one would have to adopt the perspective where all the differing interests and concerns articulated by the public can continue unfolding, while also retaining a degree of unassimilability and heterogeneity. So, on the 12th of November, day 152 of the protest, it came to clashes between police and demonstrators. Some people were wounded, and the so-called safety perimeter around the parliament building in Sofia was close to being trespassed. At this time, the University of Sofia, located just a few hundred meters from the parliament, was under student occupation. So students could then, during the night, observe the replacements of the previous barred fence with a new one composed of a black surface. This is the pre. Let us now look at photographs showing pictures of the fence made on the day before and after the clashes. So one can easily see the difference in the type of engagement occurring with the surface. Whereas there were just a few fragile pieces of paper attached to both sides of the bars before the new black fence was installed, variously, typically larger and bolder enunciations started being articulated immediately after its installation. Perhaps the most intriguing type of intervention was made by students who attached dozens of pieces of brick patterned A4 paper assembled so as to create the impression or the association with a wall. From this moment on, the fence was referred to as such, as a wall, whose materialization and articulation became part of the struggle over its meaning and use, purpose and belonging. Different small-scale interventions have taken place on the surface of the wall between mid-November and mid-January 2014. The engagement with various socio-political issues of Bulgaria's present and past emerges on the surface and takes up the form of humorous, critical, symbolic acts of investment in the political sphere. So I would like to account for intervention, this residue of direct act, as Felix Guattari puts it, as a singular and singularizing instance in Sofia's wall becoming. Another way I would like to look at the spatial product is in line with what Guattari terms a machinic assemblage. This type of ensemble constitutes an assemblage of possible fields, of virtual as much as constituted elements without any notion of generic or species relation. Guattari argues for an expanded notion of the machinic, not as an expression of technology, but as its prerequisite. The simplest material apparatus is already a machinic assemblage, as in the relationship between hammer, arm, anvil, etc. Institutions, social groups, the body, knowledge, information, and capital can all be conceived as machinic assemblages as they operate on the premise of extracting and putting in relation to each other heterogeneous elements with different degrees of authority. To take up the challenge posed by Guattari in terms of the composite nature of every object's ontological consistency would mean, in this particular case, to approach the wall not as a fixed in time and space object with a predetermined purpose. Instead, one would have to tend to the multiple appropriations and visual as well as functional transformations that the wall underwent. So, technical machines evade both simple temporalizations as well as being fixed to a single delimited territory. We thus discover, this is Guattari, as many times of deterritorialization as traits of expressive materials. An intervention implies both a separation of a subject and an object to be acted upon, as well as a position outside or adjacent to it from which the action is imposed. Thus, there is already a certain territoriality implied in the act of intervening, but also an aspiration to set the designated field in motion, to fling it into another direction, to displace its status quo. The act of intervention suggests the influx of something else, of the other, into a situation previously considered either all too stable or problematic. This authority's intervention is not arbitrary but directed. It operates in the mode of concern, which is not to say that it couldn't also have destructive or subversive intentions. Guattari writes about the machinic assemblage as always requiring and depending on exterior elements in order to exist as such. These elements are not simply forced to act in compliance to some universal machine. They are rather heterogenize and alter it, allowing it to evolve and change. The machine itself is in a relation of authority with other virtual and actual machines. In the context of interventions taking place on the surface of the wall in Sofia, the constitutive authority is manifested in the attempt to render its very presence problematic, to divert it from its assigned segregational and protective purpose. Forms of creative or humorous expressions are inserted onto it. They are, at the same time, never properly of it. This persistent sense of misbelonging bears witness to the fact that all the faltering concerns, remnants of conflicting pasts, and traces left by continuing struggles cannot be assimilated by one single homogeneous machinic body. The machine is essentially composite, heterogeneous, indeterminate in its meaning, purpose, or belonging. The machinic assemblage as an operational, dynamic concept seems most suitable to the exploration of the woe in Sofia. It threads its way through several well-rehearsed oppositions, that of discursivity and subversion, representation and assignification. It also challenges the notion of processes or activities occurring parallel to each other. We are instead dealing with moments which not only belong to a semiotic order, but are also simultaneously capable of intervening directly in a series of material machinic processes. Some discursive elements of the machine can be functional and signifying, but also act as pure intensive repetition, or refrains. These refrains provoke a process of serialization. In it, repetition, rupture, and modulation act upon objects in time. Some of their features become more and more articulated. Certain meanings stick to them more strongly, and some relations to other become integral parts of the machinic self. These acts of repetition are termed smoothing by Guattari, as they offset the small functional mistakes, material residues, and the surpluses of meaning in a machine, while asserting other aspects. Nevertheless, a smoothing isn't an unambiguous force of the establishment. By including a dimension of intensification, it also always adds something: affect, time, rhythm, integrity to the assemblage. The potential of new, foreign elements to accrue is not only permitted but rather necessary in order for a machine to continue its existence. The lingering question is how this influx is channeled, what types of self-regulatory mechanisms are already in place, and how contested an attempt to reconfigure it might be. These interrelations could perhaps be understood in terms of abstraction, when abstraction doesn't equal immateriality or detachment. According to Guattari, abstraction operates in the sense of extracting or also putting in relation to each other. Abstract machines are, quote, montages capable of relating all the heterogeneous levels that they traverse. So, to transpose these readings to the site of unrest in Sofia, one would have to tend to the different modes of abstraction that occur within it, and ask questions about how is it that one particular spatial object becomes an element capable of relating many different fields, material, temporal, imaginary, to each other, while at the same time overcoming simplistic dichotomies and totalizing movements. The wall is an abstract machine constantly shaping and refiguring itself by means of extraction. It acquires different, sometimes contradictory meanings in the process of becoming, its surface accumulating an imagery and vocabulary of protests. It weaves past events into a kind of historical assemblage, cutting through linear time. It gathers bodies and ideas, making propositions for another type of politics. This is Butler. Collective actions collect the space itself, gather the pavement, and animate and organize the architecture. In her essay, Bodies and Alliance and Politics of the Streets, Judith Butler insists that in the moments when crowds gather, the public character of space itself is being negotiated and re-articulated. Rather than taking it for granted, she calls for an understanding of the public as something which is collectively constructed. On the one hand, by virtue of the fact that action implies the necessity of moving with others and being moved by them. On the other hand, action also needs material support, an environment which too has to be assembled and that constitutes the very condition upon which action, always supported, can happen. The question that brings me to my conclusion then is whether such an understanding of action and the production of meaning as heterogeneous, supported, and collective can become the ground for effective politics. By effective, I mean politics that make difference rather than do away with it. Would an understanding of abstraction as the engaged practice of producing matter and meaning for and with others have a role to play in such politics? Thank you.